Hello, everybody. This is Melissa Mackenzie, publisher of the American Spectator, here on the second episode of the Spectacle podcast. And today we have with us a flamethrower and book writer and Claremont Institute Lincoln Fellowship Chair and Lecturer and Research Fellow of Hillsdale, Michael Anton. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Michael's book, for everybody who's in the chat and around, is right here. It's called The Stakes. And he's also had a couple pieces recently that have been causing some heartburn and talking about the state of politics right now, and also the state of the world and the state of the America and America to come. I went through the book, Michael, kind of chapter by chapter, and the other podcasts I watched really focused a lot on immigration and where we are right now with that and the elites and everything. What I wanted to ask you about is more kind of fundamental and broad, which is, why do you think there's so many people who are in denial about where we're at as a country, like seeing the cities burn and just kind of not wanting to see it?
Well, I think that's normal. That's the way human nature is. I would prefer to be one of those people in a lot of ways, right? Who wants to be, I mean, first of all, we have to stipulate that I may not be right. Maybe not, right? Maybe my gloomy sort of outlook is false. I have these conversations with my mother, and she will eventually fall back on the argument that she'll just say, I don't want to live that way. I just don't want to live that way. And it's not doing you any good to think like this. So you should just think differently. And I go, Mom, I'd love to, but I can't. I was trained a certain way. I read certain books. I learned certain arguments, and then I see the world a certain way. I come to a conclusion. I have to come to that conclusion. I can't just not. And she says, well, it's got to be hard. I wouldn't want to live that way. I think most people feel that way.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we're seeing kind of one of the things that I saw watching your Claremont Institute podcast. I was struck because I too love New York City. I love Chicago. I love these beautiful cities, and to watch them being destroyed. And you asked a question kind of rhetorically, what's in it for them? And I've wondered, what is in it for these cities that are kind of eating their own, like destroying themselves? Because you rightly, in my opinion, point out that in the book that the middle is being squashed by the elites on the one hand, and the kind of their forces, the strong arm forces at the bottom, and squishing them like average people in the middle. And yet in New York, everybody's going to be suffering by what's happening.
Well, New York lost its middle class really a long time ago, and had been losing it all throughout the second half of the 20th century. The last gasp of the outer borough middle class was the election of Giuliani in '93, which hung on and is declining ever since. And Bloomberg, who kept a lid on crime and kept the city orderly and prosperous, and in a sense even more prosperous, but explicitly changed his vision of what the city, for Rudy, New York was a global financial and American capital, but also a fundamentally, at root, an American city with a core middle class. For Bloomberg, New York was just a node, an island, a large island in what I have referred to as the Davos archipelago. And he explicitly rebranded New York. Remember, he used to call it a luxury product. Well, you pay more, but you get more. Rudy was, I want ordinary people to be able to afford to live here. Bloomberg very explicitly said, I don't care if you can afford to live here. It's the oligarchs and the plutocrats can afford to live here. That's what New York is. It's a hub for the true winners in the global economy. And the middle class can just go somewhere else. And he didn't care.
And the interesting thing is that his kind of philosophy isn't rejected on the right by a lot of the kind of economic intellectuals. I'm not going to name names here, but
I'm happy to, if you want me to.
Of people who have been...
The right has been hopeless. The right has been hopeless on this question for 30 years. And worse than hopeless, stupid. Because they don't realize that big capital, big corporations, big tech, all concentrated power, monopoly, oligarchic power, hates them, donates against them, votes against them, funds causes that seek to destroy them. And the right still thinks, wow, one more tax cut and deregulation bill. I mean, this is so great for the economy, this abstract thing. And you know, I can't tell you for how long I've been hearing conservatives talk about, oh no, we're going to we're going to win those tech guys over. They'll see any day now. And as the tech sector goes, I mean, 25 years ago when I first heard that argument, you could plausibly argue that the tech sector was 40% libertarian, but not really conservative. Now it's, I mean, woke to the core, right down to the last zillionaire, and to the last, you know, $80,000 a year coder who has to drive 2 hours to Gilroy and back every day because he can't afford to live anywhere near where he works. The conservatives are hopeless on this. Trump figured it out, and they hate Trump for having figured it out, and they hate Trump in part for having embarrassed them.
Well, it's interesting because that same argument, and I have to say that I was guilty of this philosophy myself. I was really hopeful that with like openness to China, that, you know, the freedom of, you know, products, they get richer, they stop, you know, persecuting their people, that with that kind of wealth that they will embrace civil liberties. None of that has happened.
No, that was a bipartisan bet. Well, I mean, I don't want to make this all about China. It's kind of a long story. It begins with Cold War realpolitik, with Nixon and Kissinger peeling the Chinese away from the Soviets as a sort of implicit threat that if it really came push to shove, China, with a long border with Russia on the Eurasian continent, would side with the United States. It was a check against the Russians is how that started. And I don't think anybody really when that bet was made, nobody expected Deng Xiaoping to introduce these economic reforms. And you had a kind of you had naive geopolitical liberal type saying, oh, well, this is going to be great. This is liberalized China and it will become, but you also had these cynical business interests licking their chops and saying, look at the size of that market. Let's get in there. And they came up with lots of high-minded reasons for looking at but really what it came down to was look at the size of that consumer market. And then a lot of people, above all, Henry Kissinger got extraordinarily rich by facilitating entry to China. And, you know, while they're making money on this track, on the other track, they're talking to politicians saying, no, liberalization would make China a democracy, would join the free world, and blah, blah, blah. And 30 years, this bipartisan consensus rolled on until finally Trump broke it. I mean, other people were sounding the alarm, but it really was ultimately Trump who finally broke it.
Well, it's interesting because I've got some family members who are executives at different multinational companies, and they were talking about dealing with China and how it was always a loser for the Americans.
Americans. It's a great story. So, in 1997, I was 27 years old and a graduate student, and I didn't know anything really about any of this. But I happened to be in China. I took a long trip through China, culminating in being there for the handover of Hong Kong to the Chinese from the British. But before we got to Hong Kong, we were in Beijing in a hotel bar. And I remember sitting there, not trying to eavesdrop, but you couldn't help these two businessmen, loud as hell, happy hour, getting a little bit. And they're talking about business. You couldn't help but overhear them. They were from a company I will not name, but they were talking about this, because all of this, the size of the market, it's so huge. We're going to fit in this market. It's going to explode growth. We're saturated in the US. There's nothing we could, this is going to be the greatest. And we have to turn over certain parts of our proprietary technology to make the JV deal, the joint venture deal, but it's all going to be worth it. And I'm just kind of going, okay, that company does not exist anymore. Yeah. Just for the record. And it was a big famous name. If I named it, you'd know exactly which one I meant, right? It used to dominate a certain market. It's gone. What happened? Well, they turned over their technology, they got completely cannibalized, and they never got access to that large consumer market. The whole bet totally failed. You could say that about a lot of other individual companies. You can say that about a lot of U.S. economic sectors, and you can say that about U.S.-China policy in the aggregate as a whole, both economic and political.
Well, and the maddening part of this is that it's all on the backs of the middle class Americans. So all this outsourcing, and it's it's complicated, right? Because back in the 70s when the whole auto industry was changing, the unions were out of control, the upper part of management kept making these stupid deals. And so in response to unreasonable demands, they moved manufacturing. And at the exact same time, the unions are asking for way more. And in so many ways, it reminds me of what the sports teams are doing right now here in America with their woke stuff. People are already changing their entertainment consumption away from these sports teams, and they're upping their expectations of their consumers.
Well, it gets back to when you raised the question that I raised, which is, what is a mayor like de Blasio or Lori Lightfoot getting out of having her city routinely sacked by mobs and burned and looted and destroyed? Given that the ruling class has been able to accomplish what it's been able to accomplish in the amount of time, I'm always skeptical of betting against them. They may have some sinister but well thought through reason as to why this is good. On the other hand, one also must admit the possibility that they're just two other possibilities. One is that they're just afraid of those mobs, they lack the will to take them on. They lack the will to enforce the law. Their own internal, a Rudy Giuliani would not hesitate to use the NYPD to calm the city and to arrest a lot of people, charge them, try them, because he believes in law and order and rule of law. Bill de Blasio, a leftist communist through and through, does not believe in the rule of law. He believes in critical race theory and racial grievance theory and all of this stuff. And so he believes that if people going out and looting and smashing are just and moral and morally superior to public order and decency. And so he thinks it's fine to let this happen. And even if he didn't think that, he would be, I'm convinced, afraid to use police powers because he doesn't want to offend his core constituency. And then, so it's really two things. It's fear, but it's also old time religion, right? This is just, this is right. The old order is terrible. So any means necessary to smash it. You can't rule out the possibility. I think actually it's the strongest possibility is that people like Ted Wheeler in Portland and the others I've named, and what's her name, Durkheim, I think in Seattle, and the morons who run Minnesota and Minneapolis absolutely believe that this is all justified, and they would be evil. And it would be evil if they were to try to restore order with the use of lawful force.
Well, the interesting thing is that I was just thinking about it. It was just 2 years ago, I think, that Evergreen State, the school, and I think it's in Oregon or Washington, I don't remember. And they had that big uprising, remember, by the students, and it was this whole woke thing, and they basically imprisoned the faculty and didn't let the leadership of the institution, like even the president, go to the bathroom and stuff, really kind of terroristic stuff. And there was kind of an outcry that they got funding yanked, parents stopped sending their kids there. And yet now what we're seeing is that exact microcosm everywhere in the United States. Well, not everywhere, but in blue cities.
Yeah, very widespread. Yeah, what took over the campuses in the 60s took a long time to infect the rest of America. It reminds me of the old line, how does one go broke? First gradually, then suddenly. Actually, this was gradually taking over power centers in America for quite a long time. But it took a kind of a trigger to reveal how rotten our institutions actually had become. And that trigger was pulled, apparently, in 2020. And now we know that the newspapers, the media are much worse than you thought. The universities are much worse than you thought. The corporate C-suites and HR departments are much worse than you thought. I can go on. I don't want to. I mean, it's all exhaustively detailed in the book. I pretty much take you through a grand tour of every American institution and talk about how corrupt they've become. It doesn't make for uplifting reading, but I hope it's enlightening, or at least it just makes undeniable what I think is now undeniable. Like, as you started the conversation, why do people not want to believe? Well, nobody wants to, especially when, the little patch of the world around you may not look that bad. You can still go to the grocery store and your house hasn't been burned or protested, and you still have a job and an income. You don't want to think that this is ever going to touch you. The old saying that I think Reagan used to say this, and I don't know if he coined it, but a recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours. There's a lot of people who see it and they either don't want to believe it or they're willing to believe it, but so long as it doesn't touch them, they just want to keep going with what they have, because what they have is still pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a good example of that, I'm in the middle of writing an article right now about Joe Rogan, who left California, and he was talking about the homeless people who lived outside his gate,
Yeah.
and were scaring his family. So in the abstract, you do go ahead and have sex on the street, do all these different terrible, degrading things. It's fine in theory, but when it's outside of your gate.
Well, yeah, I'm a native Californian, and the very first chapter of the book is a case study of California, what it was and what it's become. Also, it's not. I like to think it's kind of funny, but in a sad way, right? You're laughing at things you'd rather not have to laugh at, because you'd rather not have them be facts. You'd rather have the reality on the ground. But if California is going to be this way, you at least find the humor in it, that they're so idiotic. My advice to any Californian listening, unless you're a Democrat and a blue person, Democratic voter, or a blue person, in which case my advice is please stay there. Never, ever leave. Don't sell your home. Stay. I don't want you. But the rest of you who are red and Republican, get the hell out. Go. Yeah. Right? Help make red states redder, purple states redder. Get out of California for your own good and for the rest of the country's good. But the blue people, I'm thinking about. I have a working title for a piece that I have not started writing yet, called "Blue Locusts." What I most fear is the way they destroy some place, and then they go, "Oh, well, this is awful now, so let's go to Oregon and ruin it. Oh, let's go to Idaho and ruin it." I saw somebody sent me a link a couple days ago, and it was a Twitter thread of somebody going, "Oh, that's some who left San Francisco. It's so great to be in Utah now. I'm in Salt Lake City. I just saw 2 of my friends inside of 1 hour. It's like being back on Valencia Street again." And all these people from Utah were piling on, going, "What the hell are you doing? You're just going to come here and ruin it for us." But that's what they do. And
they take advantage of that. In the red states, right? There's certain people, policies, and political positions that are different. Also, culturally, it's different, and they claim to deride it, like those rubes. And yet, when they come, they the hospital
place. They realize that they ruined it. They know that they have to get out. And I saw another thread that, again, somebody sends me these links, and I look, and it was a pretty prominent guy in the tech world in California, but right of center, saying that he's hearing more people openly talk about the need to create blue enclaves in red states. So it's this kind of parallel recognition that we can't live here anymore because we've screwed it up so badly, but we still want to be morally superior, woke, hectoring, sanctimonious jerks. We just have to do it in our little blue bubbles, but be free riders on the red state law and order, stability, and fiscal sanity that surrounds us. It's grotesque, and it makes you start to think about potential. At least it makes me think about potential ways to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And I won't go into any of them now because my ideas are not ready for prime time.
Well, okay, I'd like to change gears a little bit, because one of the things that you talked about, and one of the things that has driven me crazy, is the bureaucratic state, and how and then I have another question.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
The
administrative state where, yeah. And I was just thinking as I was looking through it, because you mentioned, and of course Obama completely gutted the military, went through and just fired anyone who disagreed with his woke perspective, right? And Trump is dealing.
Fire goes a little too far. What he did is, the military has an up or out promotion system, and so if you weren't the higher up you got in the officer ranks, and to a lesser extent in enlisted ranks, but especially among officers, if you weren't very clearly down with the woke program, you just didn't get promoted. And having not gotten promoted, you had no choice but to get out. And then only people, by the time you're at the end of Obama's 8 years, basically everybody of flag and general officer rank has the opinions of a liberal Democratic corporate senior executive.
Yeah. So I was thinking, after reading that section of the book, I thought, is there one institution at all controlled by the right? And I couldn't think of one. Well, talk about a red island.
Well, and the White House. I mean, the White House is, for now, you can't say that because of that. The executive branch, right?
No, you can't.
The executive branch certainly is not. No, my friends and I have been saying this we haven't done it. We've sort of started noodling it, but let's do a real assessment. What have they got versus what do we got? And it's pretty easy to rack up a list of what they've got. It's not so easy to rack up a list of what we've got. It's not much. What we have are little islands within. I mean, if by institution you mean something broad, like a whole industry that umbrellas the institutions within it, yeah, we don't have much, if anything.
I was gonna say, maybe small. Maybe you can't count on the Chamber of Commerce, but maybe small businesses. Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, in what way are they organized?
They're not.
You can count on the Chamber of Commerce for certain things, but you can't for other things. For instance, they are rabidly open borders and open trade, and so it can't be for Trump for that reason.
Yeah.
Now, a small town chamber of commerce may feel differently, but the U.S. chamber and the big state chambers are all gonna have those opinions because they think that's where that's where the money is, and that's what's in the interest of their primary constituents and contributors, which are big companies that want low wages and outsourcing and cheap goods. So open borders, open trade, all the way for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is another way that Trump has changed my perspective as far as I'm in Texas. I've always been kind of about illegal immigration because there's so many immigrants here in Texas, both illegal and legal. And, Texas has always had a booming economy, but I feel like that it has counted on the fact that there's not a big welfare state. Yeah. There's a big enough one, mind you. I'll say that. But there's not such a huge one that people feel like they're being completely just ripped off by people who are
foreigners. As opposed to California, where you have a very generous welfare system and no border control and so on, and a state government. I mean, Milton Friedman, not someone I agree with on this. He's way too libertarian for me, but he used to say, and this is a very good point, you can have open borders or a welfare state, but not both. Now, I disagree with him. I think even open borders without a welfare state is still a bad idea. But he's certainly right that combining those two things is a much worse idea.
Right. Okay, so I kind of want to move to the end of your book because to me, that's where things got really interesting for me, where you were talking about succession from the left versus succession from the right.
Yeah, so it's not quite the end. So the book has 8 chapters, and in chapter 6, I say, I first of all, by the time you get to chapter 6, the book has outlined what I think is the present regime of the United States and contrasted it to the founding and the pre-1960s understanding of how we are supposed to be governed. And I say the Constitution and that pre-1960s understanding really does not in any way fundamentally describe how we are governed. So I lay out how I think we're governed, and I call it neoliberalism. Not the best coinage, but I use that term because it's in such wide circulation. People kind of know what it means, even though it's not ideal.
I don't really like the term because
I thought a better term, managerial. Oh gosh, now I'm forgetting what I said in my own book, and I just had it in my head. Managerial libertarian leftism is what it really is. That's the regime that we're in. But that's like, it's like 27 syllables. So,
but I think that's more accurate, though.
More accurate, and I explain why I use it, and then I say it's too long, and nobody will ever take that. So
right, it's not catchy. Yeah,
it's a combination of hyper-capitalism for favored industries, tech, finance, multinational corporations, lots of regulation for unfavored industries and for environmental causes and social causes and all that. Social libertinism, especially when it comes to sex, drugs, and substance abuse, and in every other respect, hyper intense woke religion that comes both that is forced on you directly and indirectly through the government and through corporate power. That's what I say is basically the present regime. And then in chapter 6, I ask the question, what happens if, well, first of all, what happens if present trends continue? In other words, Trump notwithstanding, who stands against all of this, but hasn't been able to undo all of this. He's been able to slow a lot of it. He's been able to prevent some of the successes for their side that would have happened had he not won the 2016 election. He's been able to undo some of it, but and the main, as Angelo Codevilla called it in his review of the book, Trump is the finger in the dike. He's not fixing the, it's too much of a task for one man in 4 years, but if his finger comes out, boom. Right. So if present trends were to continue, if the left were to get back in power and get everything they want, what would that look like? And I sketched that in chapter 6. And the second half of chapter 6 asks the question, how long can they keep that going? Right? On the one hand, you could say, maybe forever. They have all kinds of new tools and powers that no past technocratic, tyrannical regime has ever had. Leo Strauss famously to dorks, I suppose, wrote a book in 1949 called On Tyranny. And in it, as the West is waking up to the fact that there's a Cold War and the USSR is not its friend. And he says in the introduction to the book that we are now faced with the prospect of something which the ancients, the classics, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, etc., never dreamed of, which is the prospect of a tyranny, quote, perpetual and universal. That the conquest of nature, and in particular, the conquest of human nature through science, makes this prospect perhaps possible. And then we know the outcome. It wasn't. It didn't last 70 years. It's over. Roughly 70 years. Well, 72, let's say, from 1917 to 1989. What if, Strauss, wrote that before the internet, before social media, before text censorship and information flow manipulation, before big pharma, before all kinds of tools that the ruling class has now. Do those things give it enough power to make the tyranny perpetual and universal? I don't know. I hope not, because that would be horrible, but we can't really answer that. I don't think any of us can answer the question. And unfortunately, the answer to the question may have to be revealed in the playing out of the scenario. But I give, at the end, reasons to doubt that they can keep this neoliberal regime going for a long time. And those reasons are inherent contradictions within the system that they've built, and ways in which that system bumps up against natural limits and or contradicts human nature. And so if they can't keep it going, then the system that they have built will break, because I don't expect them to moderate it or modify it in a way that is more in keeping with human nature. They seem in the grip of a kind of fundamental religious passion, and they just want more of all of the same. So then chapter 7 asks the question, so if 6 is the title is if present trends continue, 7 the title is and if they don't, then what happens? And there's a lot of things that could happen that conservatives refuse to think. I actually am kind of surprised that people haven't picked up on that chapter and just bashed the hell out of me for it or ridiculed me for it. Because the typical conservative answer is, no, you don't understand. America is exceptional. We don't, we don't have coups, we don't have revolutions, we don't have collapses or secessions or Caesarism or any. Those things don't happen here. Moreover, those things really don't happen in human history at all anymore, because democracy is the final triumph of mankind, and we're already there. So these things, these political phenomena that have bedeviled the human race since there have been politics, they're all behind us now permanently. That's kind of I call that conservative alienism. And they think that. I know that they think that because they say it a lot, and it's also implicit in their writings, and I find it unsatisfying. And so I'll just imagine the following. Complete thought experiment, but imagine the following. Imagine that what I wrote about in The American Mind recently, which is stringing together a bunch of Democratic quotes and talking points and arguments and saying they're planning to steal the election if Trump wins, and they're going to try to steal it. I'm not the one saying it, they're saying it. I'm just telling you that they said it. Imagine if that happens and half the country is very angry and feels that the election was stolen. All right. But they go along because, as the Declaration of Independence says, people are more likely to suffer evils while evils are sufferable. But that anger is there. And then, Biden does the right thing and resigns, and President Harris, who is much more of a true believing woke leftist than Biden is, that's the nicest way I can put that, decides that it's really time to put the pedal down hard on certain aspects of the woke agenda, and she will brook no resistance from red middle America, who are deplorables. What would happen if people just said, or some part of it just said, I'm not going to accept this new mandate. I won't. I think it's tyrannical. I think it's unjust. You can see things happen in this country. It's possible to imagine things happening in this country that people prefer to believe could never happen in this country. And I just try to think through those scenarios in chapter 7. I'm not predicting them. I'm certainly not wishing for them. I'm saying, we as a nation, but especially the conservative intellectuals as a movement, have been derelict in their duty in not thinking about this and talking about it. So these events, if they were to happen, are going to sneak up on us because we refuse, out of some kind of high principle or failure of imagination, to even admit the possibility that something like that could happen.
Well, one of the things you mentioned is kind of there's a confluence of factors that help support your thesis, which is that a collapse could come, or that a coup could come, or that some form of Caesarism from the left or right could come. And that is that there's so much, like, our infrastructure is failing. Trump is right about that. We are so overextended as a nation financially. Everything feels very precarious. And I feel like the COVID thing has in some ways revealed even more corruption. So like I have been dismayed to see people I once respected in the scientific community, for example, being so politicized about science, like data, and misrepresenting it, and that's just another area where the corruption is complete in another institution.
Yeah. To me, the bigger problem than that even is not, I mean, that is a problem. The bigger problem is the surrendering of our political rights and our political role as a people to science, right?
Yeah.
There's this notion that, well, science has an answer. It has a correct and an incorrect answer. And the only, therefore, permissible political solution in any question is whatever science has ruled correct. If that's the case, then we're in no way democratic or Republican or free anymore. We're just slaves or servants or dutiful followers of science. The purpose of politics, according to the founders and according to Aristotle and Plato, is to get together and deliberate about the good. And the good may be knowable in a philosophic sense, but it's not a simple matter of 2 + 2 = 4 and not 5. And therefore, there's always a correct and an incorrect answer. There are competing interests and goods that have to be argued over, deliberated about, and compromised. So, first of all, the science of COVID, for instance, COVID is like the new climate change in a way. We're just told it's settled science. You have to wear masks.
Nothing is settled about it.
First of all, there's nothing settled about it. But even if there were something settled about it, if we are a free people who govern ourselves politically, then we get to deliberate about the lockdowns. We get to deliberate about mask rules, what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. We don't just get directives handed to us from science. If that's true, then scientists are the rulers and we're subjects, period. And let's just,
Well, then science is not science, it's a religion, because science is a method. It's a way of viewing and interpreting information. It isn't truth.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would go that far. I know I accept gravity. I accept certain scientific laws, although we have to remember that, Newton himself's laws of motion were, if not disproved, modified by Einstein. Every question remains open. But, if there really were a consensus about COVID or any question, I would say, okay, I'm willing to accept that as long as we keep it open. But you guys don't get to decide the political and public consequences of that. You don't.
Right.
The people do through representatives. Otherwise, why do we have them? And in a way, that question should already be, why do we have them? Why do we have these representatives? They don't do their jobs. They defer their legislative role to rulemaking apparatuses within the administrative state. They defer their oversight role to these administrative courts within the federal bureaucracy. They don't really do what they're supposed to do. And they're happy to defer legislative role to, in states especially, to governors who just write executive orders saying you have to wear a mask everywhere.
Right.
Well, how do you have
you can be in business? Right. Well, do you agree with an Attorney General Barr's statement saying that, the reaction by the government to COVID has been the greatest civil rights, one of the greatest civil rights violations in history of America? Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's astonishing to me that people don't, though.
By the way, Joe Biden has said, if he gets in there and the experts tell him we need another lockdown, he'll impose a nationwide lockdown. Well, okay, first of all, which experts? How do you know that they're, and what authority, constitutional authority do you have to impose a nationwide lockdown? I know what the real answer is because I understand what the parchment says. The answer is you don't have one. You
Right,
just don't.
exactly.
And so if you do that and it gets accepted, that's just further proof that we don't in any way live in a constitutional republic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-mm-mm. Okay, so you also mentioned, this is on page 404 and 405 of the book, just for those of you who are listening, of the
Almost at the end. I think it ends on page
almost at the end.
407.
Yeah. Okay. Here's this. Trying to get in the camera. Stakes. That's what we're talking about with Michael Anton here. Is you talk about shifting counties, states, realigning, making new states as a possible solution.
Yeah. I mean, why not? I mean, we've done it before. It's not common, but for instance, the two examples that I think I cite in the book are that Maine was created out of territory originally claimed and administered by Massachusetts. I think I have that right.
Yeah, that and West Virginia.
And certainly West Virginia was carved out of Virginia as the counties that didn't want to secede from the Union in 1860-61. There's nothing 50 is a nice round number, but there's nothing magical about it. 48, not a round number. A 48 state union won World War II and World War I for that matter. So, what's wrong with 54 or whatever it is? And I mean this in two ways. One is counties could decide to leave one state and join another, so the net number of states remains the same. For instance, when the Democrats took over the Virginia legislature and started passing harsh gun regulations, a lot of Virginia is now another one-party state where 3, 4, or 5 populous counties rule the other, I think it's 138. And the other 138 just have no say in how they're governed whatsoever.
Right.
Get outvoted, and that's that. And so these guys come into the Richmond and they just start passing gun laws that are highly restrictive on rural counties in Virginia that have been owning and using firearms since before the American Revolution. And they're ticked off about it, but they can't do anything about it because they can't outvote these people. Well, West Virginia made this, the governor and certain people in West Virginia said, hey, why don't you just leave and join West Virginia? We can kind of do this in reverse. A lot of these counties expressed an interest. Nothing has yet come of it, but I don't see why that would be such a bad thing. In addition, if I were a farmer or a rancher or somebody out in Eastern Oregon, I probably wouldn't be thrilled right now about paying taxes to Salem and to fund the fecklessness of the Portland government and the Oregon state government to just let that city burn, right? The eastern half of Oregon, Washington, and California, the eastern slices of those states, have all been very unhappy with rule from coastal elites in a long time. Why not let them go? Join other states, form their own state. There's been a movement in California for a long time, and Oregon, the southernmost tier of Oregon and the northernmost tier of California, which is all very rural, to join and carve off and create the state of Jefferson, right? If we want to stay together as a union, with the territory that we have now and the current population that we have now, we're gonna have to find a way to live together that works a little bit better than we do now, with two populations that really see the world very differently. And the problem, especially, I'll get accused of projection on this, but it's the other side that's projecting, right? Machiavelli says, I don't think I quoted this in the book. I quoted another part of chapter 9, but in the Prince chapter 9, he says that dissensions in the political community arise from these two diverse humors, which is that the great wish to command and oppress the people, and the people don't want neither to be commanded nor oppressed. The Blues want to command and oppress the Reds, and the Reds want to be left alone. I don't think there's anybody in Red America who wants to rule Blue America, wants to rule New York. San Francisco and New York absolutely want to stick it to Nebraska and Oklahoma. Right.
Well, that's been revealed in just how gleeful and hopeful they were about people dying of COVID in southern states when COVID started becoming a rising factor in Florida and Georgia, Texas. And it was like with glee, the Beltway and the media elite in New York were, it seems like, hopeful that more people died so they could say, see, you're dumber than we are here in New York.
But I intended that last chapter as, a hopeful kind of moderate thing. So say, look, we're divided now. If we continue on the course we're on, I'm not certain that we'll end up with some part of the country trying to secede, or certain that we'll end up in a civil war or one of the other horrible things that I sketch. But we could certainly turn the temperature down a lot if we want to avoid those scenarios with a more live and let live approach to politics. What happened to federalism? Federalism got overridden by the federal government itself. And a restoration of real federalism would help, as would, though, it's not just federalism. It is the problem of blue dominance coming from one city or a handful of counties over this entire red swath. So Illinois, right? Chicago rules the entire rest of the state. And a lot of which is very red and rural and doesn't have any, this problem is all over the United States. And I think we'd be better off if some of these counties, cities, hamlets, whatever various political districts were able to resort themselves so that they could practice self-government with like-minded fellow citizens within a federal union.
Well, the problem with that, though, I think, is that we're seeing, national institutions like the Supreme Court, for example, overturning the will of Californians. It was Californians, by the way, who wanted to outlaw gay marriage. It goes to the Supreme Court and they undo it. And they undo the will of the people in one of the most liberal states in the country. And if that continues, the
courts are an entirely a separate problem that is very hard to solve, because on the one hand, you have to have a court system, and I think ultimately, if you're going to have a constitution, you have to have some form of judicial review. But the real problem, I think, is not so much judicial review, and some of my friends will disagree about that. The real problem is the elevated role of the courts into a political branch. It's in a way, the political branches voluntarily reducing their own status as a political branch, and the courts raising theirs without a check. So I go back to Lincoln on this. Lincoln had it right in the Dred Scott decision. He says, look, if we're going to have a court system, then we have to let the court rule on the individual merits of the case. But the court is not the final arbiter on the Constitution. Every member of the government takes an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. I have a say, he wasn't president then, but the chief executive has a say, Congress members have a say, senators have a say. The court it's not in a sense the expert that rules for all time on every question. It rules on individual cases. And it may even rule in a sense of judicial review, but there are remedies to judicial review that the political branches have ceded, and they need to reassert their control if we're going to have a constitutional republic. But we definitely have to think through a way to get over the rule of judges, or critarchy, as I call it, as a Greek neologism, which I did not coin.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest problems and interferences with federalism right now as it stands, because they will overrule a certain state's will decide a certain thing for their state, and then it goes to the federal bench, or then it goes to the Supreme Court, and it's overruled there by people who don't live there, who aren't represented by, have no real links to that state, and everybody abides by it. Even Donald Trump has basically bidden whatever the court has decided, and hasn't pushed back on it.
I think, though, this is a real problem on the conservative side that my friends at Hillsdale and in the Claremont Institute have been working on. I don't think we've found a satisfactory answer yet, but I think our way is the most promising way, which is a reassertion of the political role of the political branches of government in constitutional interpretation. Don't lie down and cede all of this turf to the court system. You take the same oath to protect, defend, and uphold the Constitution of the United States.
Yeah, but the problem too is, and this is more corruption, and this is a problem on the right and the left, where they don't want to live with the consequences of going against their funders, all of the corporate interests, all of those elites that are putting the money into the coffers of the various paid politicians. And so they are mute on the topics that would be a problem. There's some notable exceptions to that, Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and whatnot, but they'll never get a dime from these big corporations.
Look, at the end of the day, the court problem, you either solve it, or there's this state county reorganization that or maybe not even a state county, but certain red states just say, I'm going to defy you, court. And President Harris, send the 82nd Airborne and see how that goes. And then she either has the
President Harris
moxie, the will to spend, or she doesn't. And they either follow the order or they don't. And then they either successfully coerce the red state or they don't, and we can test that in the theory. Or these red states just acquiesce, as you say, which is what's been going on right now. Most of red America, every time the court decides something, they just lie down for it. Well, we just get more of that, in which case we're in chapter 6 in a sense. The leftist neoliberal project keeps on marching along, or they successfully resist and the feds back down, or it creates a crisis that somehow breaks the regime. I mean, all of these things are possibilities that nobody wants to talk about or think through, but I think we're going to need to, because I just think the kind of feral thirstiness for absolute power and revenge that I've seen on the left lately means that once they're back in office, they're not going to. Yeah, the image that Biden is trying to project right now is, I'm the calm guy, and there's all this craziness, but it'll all stop and cool off when I'm in there. I think they've unleashed the furies and they don't know how to rein them in, and I think Biden lacks the knowledge, the will, and the capability to rein them in. And so once they're in power, they're going to start doing extremely nasty and provocative things that may or may not provoke a reaction. There are reasons to believe it won't provoke a reaction, because look at what middle America has been willing to put up with for so long. You could say, the spirit's gone, the spirit's been drained out of them, they won't do anything. You could also say they haven't quite been pushed hard enough yet. And, you can push people really hard for a really long time, but eventually you find that point beyond which they won't go. And if any group of politicians is going to find it, it's, Elizabeth Warren and AOC and Harris and the Squad and then this current crop of lefties. They'll keep pushing until they find it, arguably. Again, I'm not a seer. I don't make predictions. I just try to game out possibilities so that people can start talking about it.
Well, let me introduce a new possibility, because it's something that's happening here in Texas. So Greg Abbott is the governor here, and the state conservatives, I would say probably a good half of the state, is mutinous because of how he kind of kowtowed to what is perceived as the kind of the scaredy scientists, and imposing this mask mandate, making these rules for businesses that they can't be open or whatever. And what I've started to see locally here, and this is completely anecdotally, but it is concerning and heartening at the same time, is just outward absolute defiance, where people are just not following the rules and saying, you know what, I'm not wearing a mask, I'm not doing this. And the other thing is that Trump supporters are starting to gather together spontaneously on their own. And I'm not going to say where, but I know in my county that there's some places where, and they're having these discussions like every weekend. They're getting together and they're talking about what are we going to do if this continues, because this can't continue. And so one of the problems that we've had here in Texas is in conservative counties like where I'm living, is the local people have been already just about to tar and feather the leadership. So when the governor came out with these rules, the local judge of the county, which is the way it's structured, basically said, we're not following them, we're not abiding by them.
I mean, on the one hand, we shouldn't be surprised, but maybe on the other hand, we shouldn't be surprised, because this is a country born in a revolution. And so the people, or presumably some remnant of them, have the revolutionary spirit within them. The character of a nation can transcend generations and centuries. On the other hand, it's a little bit surprising, again, because of what the American people have been willing to put up with for so long. But I requote that phrase from the Declaration of Independence, that men are I won't get it exactly right, but are willing to suffer evils while evils are sufferable, rather than change arrangements under which they've been accustomed. Maybe we're getting to that breaking point now. I mean, I think it is crazy. I said in the book that only three, as it looks to me now, only three really historically important things have happened in my lifetime. The first, that is like geopolitical things. The first was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I guess you could call those two events, 1989 and then the formal in 1991, or whenever the Soviet Union formally dissolved. I guess summer of 91 was the attempted coup to put Gorbachev, to remove Gorby, and it failed. But by 92, the Soviet Union is formally dissolved. The second is 9/11. And the third is I link them, the COVID and the woke riots, the mass shutdown of the economy, these lawless mask mandates and social distancing mandates, and you can go into this store and shop in aisle B, but you can't shop in aisle C because of you don't need the products in aisle C. But these kinds of crazy things that like the governor of Michigan is doing. I mean, these are tyrannical. They may not be gulag level tyrannical, but they are arbitrary and lawless. And a people with a revolutionary spirit will only put up with so much of that before they say no.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting to me because I think looking at, there's a lot of people buying guns right, left and center right now.
So if anyone is listening in your Texas groups that get together on the weekends, and this sounds kind of alarmist, but I mean it seriously, the federal government will increasingly treats any kind of resistance, any kind of skepticism about its authorities to do stuff as domestic terrorism.
Yeah.
And so be very careful what you say and how you say it and stuff, because you don't want them to swoop in and call you the federal government. I mean, apart from Trump and the people around Trump, the governing powers in this country have no problem with armed insurrection so long as it's BLM and Antifa blowing stuff up and burning down cities. As soon as people get together to defend their liberties, the government leaps into action and goes right at your throat. So be very careful how one handles this.
Oh, how should one handle this? I mean, at some point, though, if what you're saying is true, and we're in a place where we've got this, and it is true, we've got this polarization, and basically we have the left and the powers that be, everybody but Trump, every institution, basically, kind of pushing the finger right into the chest of the American people, the average middle class person. There's gonna be some kind of confrontation at some point, I would think.
Possibly. As I said, it really depends on the remaining spirit. I don't know. I don't make predictions. But it's certainly possible, and it's something that I said in the preface of the book. In a way, I wrote it as a warning. I know it will be an unheeded warning. It will certainly be an unread warning. I don't expect anybody on the left to read this book, but I believe it's in their interests to back off. They already own and control everything. I mean, obviously they don't own everything. Middle America, red America still has equity in homes and some money in the bank, although less than they used to, right? But in terms of the power centers, they've got it all. They've got the companies, the universities, the banks, the tech firms, the foundation. I mean, you name it, the government bureaucracies at every level, they've got everything. And they get their way on every public question of importance and even of non-importance, and have been for 50 years. Take yes for an answer. You won. It's your country. And get your foot off the neck of these people in middle America. Back off a little bit, and then you won't provoke this reaction. And then you'll get to stay in power for longer and enjoy the fruits of your winnings, is my advice to them. Again, they won't read it, and they wouldn't heed it if they read it. But it was well-intentioned.
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is that whenever the incursions, say by these terroristic Antifa BLM types, when they have tried to go into the burbs anywhere, it hasn't worked so well.
But I'd be very wary, at least at this point, of organizing resistance to Antifa even in the suburbs, because police departments that show no willingness now, and I'm not blaming the police, because some of this maybe comes from orders from their mayor or their governor, and some of it maybe comes from genuine fear that if they go and arrest these guys and something goes wrong, they'll get fired and arrested, the cops that way, that is. And so why put your life on the line when you know you don't have political backing? But there are too many cases where a law enforcement that won't do anything about a riot leaps into action when somebody exercises their lawful self-defense. That to me is the worst aspect of 2020. Well, I think, I can say that. I may want to take it back later because there's so many bad aspects to 2020, but it's the worst aspect of 2020. Having learned something about the founding in grad school and from reading books, I know that for the founders, the purpose of government is to use state power for the protection of equal natural rights, which come from nature, but that are hard to secure in nature. Nature gives you the rights, but does not provide an enforcement mechanism. Human beings have to build the enforcement mechanism, and that's called a government. And one of your fundamental rights is the right to life, which means you inherently have a natural right to self-defense. So when government shirks its duty to protect you and then punishes you when you try to protect yourself, government is doing 180 degrees the opposite thing of what it's supposed to do. And if there were anything that would provoke a serious response, a justified response from the American people, it would be that. And so I would hope if there's anybody in government who's listening who has power over decisions like this, they would realize they're doing something extremely foolish, contrary to the natural law, contrary to human nature, and I would also say evil. It is evil to refrain from using your police powers against people doing evil and then use your police powers only against people defending themselves against evil. That's not merely a dereliction of duty. That's just sick. And that's unfortunately, what we have in too many parts of the country right now.
Well, so I'm going to, we're getting close on time. And I have a friend who says that basically our American citizens have to decide what kind of judge they want. Like if they get arrested, what court are they going to come before? Who are their peers? And increasingly, it's unsafe to be in a blue state, blue city, if you do not toe the lines.
Yeah.
De Blasio and Cuomo in New York sent in health inspectors into a restaurant that was having a Blue Lives Matter or kind of a fundraiser for first responders on 9/11. And it was just purely because the guy who owned the place had said nasty things about the governor. I mean, that is just almost unbelievable abuse of power.
Law
is
also undermining and has greatly undermined the regime. And you can, I have a whole section in chapter 3 of the book on equal justice under law and how that's become a complete joke, from the Hillary emails to the treatment of Mike Flynn versus Roger Stone versus James Comey and all of this stuff. But we're seeing it almost on every level now. And, going after pastors for opening their church and the mask mandates. But, hey, Black Lives Matter can fill Prospect Park in Brooklyn or wherever, and no masks, no social distancing, cheek by jowl, absolutely nothing happens to them from the government, and the press pretends like it's no big deal. I do love the way President Trump trolls the media now when he says, well, Mr. President, how can you have all these people over? He says, we're a peaceful protest. And they get so angry. That's over. That's what the heck? What's the difference?
Right.
We're a peaceful protest.
Yeah.
I think he's right. We are. Trump supporters are a peaceful protest against the real regime, which on paper nominally he leads, but in reality, because of administrative state power and media power and corporate power and tech power and all that, he doesn't lead. He only leads his part of it. God bless him. I'm going to vote for him. I'm a supporter. I will remain a supporter. And I hope he is reelected and has an extremely successful second term. And I hope that one of the things that makes his second term more successful is that he gets a better handle on the levers of power in the executive branch and is able to use them more effectively against resistance from the inside, which he will face. But hopefully in a second term, there will be less of that and more effective use of power by him and his team.
I actually have a solution for that problem, Michael. We don't have much time, but he is a businessman after all. And, GE used to do this where they would take 10%. And I say take 10% off the government.
The problem is, of course, federal civil service protections make that impossible. So you have to change the law, or it's the kind of, what's the law? Who cares? The problem is that Republicans are totally obligated to abide to the letter of the law. Democrats can kind of do what they want when they're in power, but I don't think he would successfully be able to fire any real significant portion of the federal bureaucracy.
Oh man, you're no fun. So, then we go on a freeze, and then by attrition, let these people just
done and have been attempted, and attrition is good. Yeah. There's a lot of reforms that need to take place, and I try to sketch my hopeful, forward-leaning policy agenda in Chapter 8. It's a sort of happy. I call it the book's happy ending. So you've been depressed for 7 straight chapters. Well, now here's a little uplift, and basically the uplift is do everything Anton says, and everything will be fine.
Yeah. Well, and Anton says to elect President Trump, so reelect him. So it's just, I know you're not in the prediction business, but if you had to guess right now, do you think Trump wins or loses?
My unfortunate guess right now is that he actually does win the vote, but that it's fuzzed up in enough states and then litigated via street protests and in the courts that we're just plunged into chaos. And I have no idea how that resolves or when. I will say, though, that it's hard to, I can count on one finger the number of times an election went into a scenario like that and the Republican won. They just outgun us when it comes to those kinds of techniques for resolving a disputed election, and they're ready for it now. In fact, they're trying to create the condition for it now so that they can win that battle. They'll lose on the November 3rd, and then they win the next 30 days or however long. And then I think that's what they're trying to do, and it scares me.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, one of the things I was telling a friend is that you have to look at the blue states or the purple states where there's a Democrat AG.
Yeah.
And where
Democrat Secretary of State, Democratic.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll be finding, like what happened in Minnesota. There'll be all of a sudden there'll be trunks full of votes that we couldn't find, and they'll magically appear. And
it's happened many times before. The only time I can think of that a Republican won in such a scenario, and it wasn't exactly the same scenario, was Florida in 2000. But that was a different scenario because Florida 2000, remember, there was a vote count. There was a final tally. And it was whatever it was, 552 for Trump. You know, he had a 552 margin or something. They
Bush v. Gore for people who don't.
Yeah, right. They weren't counting ballots that were still flowing in via the mail or backing trucks up going, oh, I found these in a polling place. They were saying, no, this is the count. These are the votes. Let's just recount them to see if there's a, remember.
Dangling chads,
dangling chads, pregnant chads, swinging door chads, all this stuff.
It was crazy. But the thing is, as someone rightfully pointed out, we haven't had an election since then that the left has viewed as legitimate, unless except for Obama.
Democracy has been redefined, and this started actually in Europe, and it's come to us. Democracy has been redefined as the correct outcome, whatever the process. So if the correct outcome is achieved via voting, that's democracy. If it's achieved by a regulatory fiat, that's democracy. If it's achieved via a judicial ruling, that's democracy. If it's achieved via street protest and a color revolution, that's democracy. If the people vote for something that's the wrong outcome, that's not democracy. So, Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's won, I think he won his last election with like 69% of the vote or something.
Right.
Overwhelming. That's not democracy in this view.
Right. Well, what is it? Duda and
Duda, he didn't win by as much, but he won, a comfortable 50s. And no, not democracy.
Not democracy
in this view. So therefore, by definition, this is how the Democrats are getting themselves psyched up for 2000. A Trump victory, he can't win. Because even if he wins, it's not democracy, and democracy is sacrosanct. But democracy is, democracy is in a way come to mean the opposite of rule by the people.
Right. It's ruled by the elites, and they're very angry minions. Okay. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. I urge all of you who are watching to go out and buy his book, The Stakes. He urges you to. It's already in its second printing. He's sold so many. And so you need to go out and buy them. Buy them for your friends and family.
To make me rich. It's actually pretty good, and you should read it.
Yes, I did read it, and it is pretty good. Very good. I a little alarming, I would say. But for anybody who's been paying attention to things.
Also, just for the audience, it's not like it's different. I think it's unique among recent, and if not all conservative, public. It's not your typical conservative. Freedom works, low taxes, deregulation. We love Reagan. I love Reagan. I love all those things. This book is not that. You've not read this before, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, this book is definitely not that. But for the new America that I see and the reality that we have here, and the issues that Trump really has brought to light with his presidency, it's the book I think we need. And so thanks so much, Michael, for joining us. And thank you very much for all of our listeners. Really appreciate that. And onward. And let's hope that you're wrong about the election.
I'm